quietly gobbling up vast swathes of the American economy, private equity focuses on short-term gains, which means it destroys industries, businesses, and lives. It is the predator of predators. This is it, people. Come and see the final boss of this republic. Private equity firms are investment management companies that pool money from multiple wealthy investors to purchase and manage other existing businesses for the sole purpose of selling them a short time later for a profit, which is then distributed back to the investors. They claim to make businesses more efficient, i.e., more profitable, by aggressively cutting costs and injecting fresh capital to fuel expansion. It's existed in its modern form since the 1940s, though it was quite small in scale until the 1980s when it experienced its first boom and bust cycle. This is quite different from other types of business investment that emerged alongside it. Whereas venture capital typically invests in young startup companies with the intention of seeing them grow, private equity focuses exclusively on existing, mature businesses, often with well-known brand names. In practice, they are often accused of gutting the businesses they purchase in exchange for short-term profits, cutting staff, reducing product quality, selling off assets like real estate, and, critically, loading these businesses with huge amounts of debt, while sucking out money to pay themselves massive dividends and fees. This is why they're often called the vampires of Wall Street, sucking the life out of the companies they temporarily own. Essentially, they're asset strippers, although pro-private equity types surely disagree. You could almost compare them to a chop shop buying a car, stripping out all the parts and selling them individually. You sell the stripped out car for more than what you bought it for, and you call it more efficient. They specifically purchase private companies rather than those traded publicly on the stock market, or they may target public companies ideally distressed or undervalued with the intention of taking them private, usually as soon as possible. The reason for this is they can get much larger returns from private companies where finances can be opaque to regulators and the public at large, and where the numbers can be moved around a little bit, versus public companies that must at least somewhat be transparent to their public shareholders.
I'll start by saying I just left my second Blackstone board meeting so energized, so excited.
Private equity firms generally aren't open to individuals. There are exceptions for certain ultra-wealthy people, but generally, private equity investment is for institutional investors. They are favored by sovereign wealth funds, university endowment funds, big insurance companies of all sorts, and some of their biggest investors are pension funds, including public pension funds, which comprise about a third of all private equity investment. If you're a former public employee receiving retirement benefits, there's a good chance some of that money is coming from returns on private equity investment, and there's a good chance you never had any say or even knew about it. About half of all daily newspapers in the United States are owned by private equity or hedge funds. 3 private equity firms control over 90% of the prison telecom industry, charging extortionate rates for prisoners to talk to their families thanks to the cartel that they enjoy. Private equity has over $1 trillion invested in the energy sector, with about $800 billion of that in fossil fuels. Globally, the private equity market is estimated to be worth $4.4 trillion, twice as much as it was worth just 8 years ago. And those figures are the market value of private equity as an industry, the profits that they're expected to generate. The total assets of the industry, the value of everything they own, are estimated to be worth over $13 trillion, and that's growing by about 20% every year. Of course, it's difficult to get exact numbers on how much of America and the world that they own, because these are highly secretive private companies. So what's the problem with private equity buying up America? Well, there are three main problems, and I say problems, they are problems if you're not a psychopath. First, private equity firms primarily use debt to finance their purchasing of businesses. That's called a leveraged buyout. But that debt doesn't go on their own balance sheets. Rather, the company they purchase takes on that debt, which is then used to fund expansion and pay dividends back to the private equity investors. So the acquired company is on the hook for the loans taken out by private equity to purchase themselves. In addition, the acquired company is typically charged performance fees, usually 20% of all profits. This really is more of a tithe or a tribute, and it creates a powerful impetus to cut costs by any means necessary in order to make payments on these loans and fees. The key thing here is that private equity is looking to suck money out of the companies they purchase, in part by loading them up with debt. One method of doing this is to engage in what's called a sale-leaseback deal, where the acquired company sells off its land, then rents it back from the company that they sold it to, with the money made from the sale going to the private equity firm. Often, the private equity firm will also own the company they made the acquired company sell the land to, in what I would describe as a sort of corporate feudalism or vassalage. Second, private equity firms can make huge profits even if the company they bought goes bankrupt, say if the companies are unable to repay the debt incurred for their own acquisition. The private equity firm just pays itself huge dividends and fees before the company that they bought goes under. That's all they really have to do. That's the entire business model. Why wouldn't they do this? There's zero risk in what they're doing because they're not doing it with their own money. They're borrowing money in the name of the company they're purchasing, and it's all legal. If things go right, they make a ridiculous amount of money. If things go wrong, they make a ridiculous amount of money, and don't face any negative consequences. Critics of the industry argue that, at least sometimes, private equity will intentionally drive companies into bankruptcy, stripping them of all value before letting them fail. And this model does seem to be proven at this point. Thirdly, and most importantly, private equity firms have very short-term, profit-driven goals. They are not about creating value, but rather extracting and concentrating it into the hands of the few. The majority of their money is made when they resell the company, and their goal is to do that within about 5 to 8 years, though sometimes it's as little as 2 years. During that time, they're looking to cut costs as much as possible, as quickly as possible, to make the company more profitable, on paper at least, for the eventual future buyer, usually a big fish themselves, but no killer whale, and really a sucker in comparison. The fastest way to cut costs is to increase prices, fire workers, replace highly trained workers with cheaper ones, cut services, replace expensive equipment with cheaper versions, and reduce the quality of the products or services being sold, but not the price. Things you wouldn't necessarily do if you had your eye on long-term stability. Things you wouldn't necessarily do if it was your company. And it gets worse. In the healthcare industry, private equity has been pushing patients toward unnecessary procedures to bilk money out of them. Private insurers and government programs like Medicare and Medicaid. These strategies for procuring short-term profit can have long-term damaging effects, not just for people, but also for the companies they buy, which we are seeing more and more as private equity gobbles up an ever-increasing share of the economy in vastly different sectors. A good example of this would be Toys R Us. Once America's biggest toy store, sales began to flatten out in the 1990s. In 2005, the company was purchased by a group of investors, led by two major private equity firms, KKR and Mitt Romney's company, Bain Capital. They bought Toys R Us by taking out $5 billion in loans, which Toys R Us itself would be responsible for paying. Then, they did a sale-leaseback deal, selling all the land underneath Toys R Us stores to a third party, who then rented the land back to Toys R Us. The money generated from that sale was pocketed by the private equity firms. Then they began cutting costs, mostly by firing people, so that Toys R Us could pay for the massive debt taken out for its own acquisition, in addition to paying rent on the stores they had previously owned. Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy in 2017. Before being purchased by private equity, the company had about $2 billion in cash and about $2 billion in debt. Upon filing for bankruptcy, they had about $300 million in cash and $5 billion in debt, for which they were paying $500 million in interest every year. The private equity firms had stripped all the money out of the company, and 33,000 people lost their jobs.
I ain't gonna take any chances. You're hanging around with me, see?
Then there's the real estate industry. According to Business Insider, private equity currently accounts for 44% of all flipped single-family homes. While mortgage rates are too high for individual home buyers, private equity can pay in cash, sometimes within minutes of the home being listed, scooping up houses and cheaply flipping them, driving up prices, or turning them into rentals. In some parts of America, private equity firms are purchasing entire neighborhoods. In Phoenix, Arizona, and Atlanta, Georgia, 30% of all homes going on the market are being purchased by private equity. And it turns out, shock horror, Wall Street firms make terrible landlords, raising rents, tacking on bullshit expenses, and charging extortionate application fees while refusing to perform basic maintenance. And if they purchase entire neighborhoods, they can influence the market rate of entire communities across the country. Hell, if they can do that, they can influence demographics, election districts, and so on. And this trend is growing rapidly. An analysis from MetLife predicts that by 2030, private equity could own 40% of all single-family homes in the United States, converting them to rentals, compounding the housing crisis and driving rents further into the stratosphere, because ka-ching, suckers! Overall, the share of the housing market owned by investment firms is increasing at a rate of about 10 to 15% every year. Then there's the tourism industry, a burgeoning market for private equity. In Hawaii, they own 30% of all hotel rooms in the entire state. And then there's retail, where they love to strip assets as fast as possible. Between 2015 and 2019, about 2/3 of retail companies that went bankrupt were owned by private equity. And then there's the education industry, because everything is an industry. Private equity is buying out hundreds of private colleges and turning them into for-profit companies, where they increase tuition rates while reducing educational quality, producing students with lower graduation rates, lower lifetime earnings, higher student loan debt, and higher default rates. Around 35% of for-profit colleges are owned by private equity firms. They're also big in the restaurant industry, with control of tons of major brands: the Cheesecake Factory, Benihana, P.F. Chang's, TGI Fridays, Dunkin' Donuts, Popeyes, Buffalo Wings, Panera Bread, Red Lobster, all owned in whole or in part by private equity. With its recent bankruptcy, the media has focused on Red Lobster losing $11 million in a single quarter on bottomless shrimp, but that's just chump change. In 2014, Red Lobster's parent company, Darden Restaurants, sold Red Lobster to a private equity firm called Golden Gate Capital for $2.1 billion. Golden Gate Capital immediately paid themselves back that $2.1 billion by doing a sale-leaseback deal, They sold the land out from under the restaurants to a third party, and they made the restaurants rent that land back. The already struggling restaurants couldn't afford to pay the steep rent on buildings they had previously owned, and they began serious cost-cutting measures like firing staff and reducing food quality even more from the chum it already was. And so Red Lobster sank with anywhere between $1 billion and $10 billion in debt. Why such a wide range? Because it's all private and basically secret. And the top 5 grocery retailers in the United States, Kroger, Walmart, Costco, Target, and Albertsons, all of them are at least partially owned by private equity, as were many chains that have already gone bankrupt. From 2015 to 2018, 7 major grocery retailers were bankrupted by private equity, plundering them in the same way, shuttering thousands of stores nationwide and costing over 100,000 people their jobs. AP Fairway, Tops, Fresh and Easy, Hagen, BILO, Bruno's, Winn-Dixie, Fresco y Mas, Harvey's, Marsh Supermarkets.
Freshness from around the world is right around the corner.
And also, private equity firms have been quietly buying up the US defense sector, beginning in the early 2000s, when that lovely jolly into the sand and dust meant big money for the defense industry. In 2019, private equity firms were behind 42% of all defense contractor takeovers. In 2021, they invested $15 billion into about 140 different defense-related companies. And this year, 2024, the United States defense budget is $825 billion, and over half of it is going and has gone to defense contractors. Defense contractors, sometimes just the people who make chemical weapons, sometimes pure mercenary scum. Remember Blackwater, the private military company responsible for the Nizour Square massacre in Iraq, where Blackwater employees shot at Iraqi civilians, killing 17 people and injuring 20? Maybe you don't remember because things like that happened all the time with those PMCs. 4 Blackwater employees were convicted in federal court, and they went to prison before being pardoned by Donald Trump, right before he left office. Even though there is no doubt at all that they did what they did. Well, after the whole Iraq thing, Blackwater changed its name a few times. It really had to. It was mired in allegations of torture, incompetence, and massive corruption. It's now called Constellis, and it's owned by Apollo Global Management, the second largest private equity firm in America. What could go wrong with their private group of mercenaries all ready to take a lovely gift for their corporate masters like the dogs they are? According to the American Investment Council, private equity generated $1.7 trillion in gross domestic product in 2022, about 6.5% of the GDP of the entire country. In the last 10 years, private equity groups have invested $1 trillion into the healthcare industry. They currently own 30% of all for-profit hospitals in the United States, and about 2/3 of all air ambulances. Just 2 firms, KKR and Blackstone, own 30% of all outsourced emergency room doctors. Well, I suppose reason would take us to the conclusion that the profit motive leads to greater efficiency and better patient outcomes. Wrong! We know what the profit motive leads to. We have 100 years of examples of what the profit motive leads to, and it's more profit. And more profit does not necessarily mean anything else but more profit. And some things shouldn't necessarily be about profit. For example, hospitals. Crazy. But saying all that, here is a commercial for some poison so I can keep the lights on. Enjoy. Did it run? If it didn't, go back so it runs. And I'll buy you a beer next time I see you. I mean, you know, as long as it's not in London or anything. I'm not made of money. I think I've just made that clear. You buy me a beer. And we have plenty of examples of how this can play out in real life. Private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management purchased the Steward Healthcare Hospital system by taking out a loan of about $1 billion, which Steward would be responsible for repaying, then did a sale-leaseback deal where they sold all the real estate of the hospital system to a third party, Medical Properties Trust, who rented the land back to Steward, pushing them even further into debt, while Cerberus Capital Management extracted about $800 million from Steward over the course of a decade. Steward went broke, stopped paying its bills and its employees, and people died. But you know who didn't go broke? The suits in the C-suite. A study from 2023, which looked at 5 million hospitalization records, found that in private equity-owned hospitals, the rates of hospital-acquired conditions is 25% higher. That is, you're 25% more likely to get injured while in the hospital if the hospital is owned by private equity. What sorts of injuries? Blood infections, broken bones, MRSA, all the good stuff. And it isn't just hospitals. Ambulance companies, hospice care, nursing homes, urgent care centres, specialty clinics, fertility centres. All of them are increasingly being purchased by private equity. One study from 2021 found that when private equity takes over nursing homes, the use of antipsychotic medication increases by 50%. I guess if you keep the patients sedated, you don't need as many staff to take care of them. Jeez. And in private equity-owned nursing homes, mortality rates are 10% higher and prices are 10% higher. And yes, private equity-owned nursing homes often involve sale-leaseback deals. What about something more specialized? The autism services industry, as it is becoming to be called, is a hotspot for private equity investment. From 2017 to 2022, 85% of autism service company buyouts were done by private equity. They are now the dominant owners of autism service centers in the United States. As an example of how that's going, in 2018, Blackstone bought the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, or CARD. When they bought it, it was the largest provider of autism behavioral services in the United States, with 265 locations nationwide that helped autistic children learn and communicate better. During that time, Blackstone closed 100 of the least profitable locations. They cut staff, and they reduced the required amount of training for its behavioral therapists, from 86 hours of training to 36. Staff wages were frozen, nobody could get a raise anymore, resulting in a worker exodus. Children who were attending therapy at the clinic were also told they needed to come more often, up to 40 hours per week per child. More sessions with cheaper staff means more profit, and of course, there was a sale-leaseback deal. Blackstone sold the real estate to a different company, kept the money, and forced CARD to rent its own properties back. When Blackstone purchased CARD, the company had zero debt. 5 years later, it had $160 million in debt, and it filed for bankruptcy. And these are not the only industries they're getting into. I didn't even mention the commercial fishing industry, the tourism industry, veterinary clinics, the energy sector, the agricultural industry, or the daycare industry. What is this all for? Well, as usual, making the wealthiest people in the world even more wealthy. Of course, same as it ever was. Oh no, sorry, I mean it's for making things more efficient, isn't it? Creating jobs. Otherwise we'll all end up under a bridge.
I see you're finally harvesting our rice crop. It's about time.
Our rice crop. So far, I've done all the work. And there's still a lot of work to do.
No, it's for propping up people like Steven Schwarzman, the CEO of Blackstone, the largest private equity firm in America. His annual salary is $900 million. His net worth is $38 billion, $6 billion more than his net worth 1 year ago. And he needs all that money for palaces and private islands and yachts and sports cars and, of course, political donations. He's currently fundraising for Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign. Although his company Blackstone donates to both political parties in the last year, they've donated $5.5 million to Republicans and conservative groups versus $2 million to Democrat and liberal groups. This money, I know, doesn't seem like much, but that's just the money we know about, the money that's on record. Thanks to Citizens United and the advent of so-called dark money, we have no idea how much private equity is actually spending in its purchasing of American politicians and the apparatus of state. But, with the numbers we do know, private equity is indeed spending money on both sides of the aisle. In the last year, pre-election, the biggest recipient of direct campaign contributions from private equity firms, not including dark money, was President Joe Biden. Because they don't believe in anything except more and more and more wealth for themselves. Not for America, for themselves. In short, private equity. They're looting America, looting it from normal working people and stuffing it into the bank accounts and Louis Vuitton purses of an elite that is meant to be antithetical to this nation's existence. I think in some ways it's worse than feudalism. They're counts and dukes without any of the obligations, extracting money from each and every one of us right under our noses, and it's all perfectly legal. They take none of the risk and all of the reward. They get outsized returns when things go right, and when things go wrong, they are completely insulated from consequence. Either way, they get insanely rich. So, what's going to happen? Well, here's my prediction, and I say this as a nobody, just some guy. Private equity's incursion into all of these important parts of the economy, housing, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, food production, defense, is going to push them into too big to fail territory. And eventually, there will be bailouts. As such a huge part of the economy, if we let them fail, will enter a massive depression. People will lose their homes, their jobs, their retirement benefits. It could bring down whatever government we have at that time. Oh no. So the taxpayers will be on the hook to provide welfare to some of the wealthiest people in the world, just like in 2008. And because private equity and those around them have such control over the institutions and the media of America, the citizens will blame each other. They'll blame the poor, the minorities, the immigrants, gay people, black people, the political team that they don't belong to, tall people, short people, anyone other than the ultra-rich and their cronies, while the billionaires who caused the whole thing will be rewarded rather than punished, and celebrated rather than ground into food for the Suids. They will face no repercussions, no loss of wealth, no jail time, while the rest of us struggle in the aftermath. They'll be pissing in our mouths and telling us we love it, and we'll believe them. And when I say we, I don't mean you and me, but the many who are thankful for the crumbs that our lords and masters allow us to fight over. I think that I'm starting to realize that some people won't realize that the room is on fire until they're choking on smoke. I guess COVID was a clue, wasn't it? Well, anyway, thanks very much for watching. See you next time. I guess there is no revolution or apocalypse or anything. This is it. Just rinse and repeat, so we dig.